There is a moment in every conflict when the balance of patience shifts, when one side miscalculates the threshold of the other's tolerance and triggers a response they were not prepared for. We may be approaching that moment in the Persian Gulf right now, and the signals coming from Washington are clearer than they have been at any point since this war began on February 28th. For over 2 months, Iran has operated on a consistent and coherent strategic calculation. Close the Strait of Hormuz, maintain economic pressure on the United States and its allies, stall every diplomatic opening with unworkable counterproposals, and wait for the international community to force Washington into offering meaningful concessions. That calculation has produced real results. Oil prices are up nearly $20 a barrel. Gas prices in America have reached $4.52 per gallon. The U.S. military has spent $29 billion on this conflict already, with projections suggesting the total cost could ultimately exceed $1 trillion. Iran looked at those numbers and concluded that time was on their side. They may have badly miscalculated. This week, something shifted in Washington in a way that experienced observers of this administration are taking seriously. The language coming from the president, from the Secretary of State, and from senior military commanders has changed in tone, in urgency, and in directness. Sources familiar with White House discussions told CNN this week that President Trump is now more seriously considering a resumption of major combat operations than at any point in recent weeks. Multiple senior administration officials have begun to openly question whether Tehran is even capable of arriving at a genuine negotiating position. Today, we are going to cover exactly what changed, what Iran did this week that accelerated Washington's shift toward a harder posture, what the U.S. military is specifically positioned to do when the order comes, and what the full strategic picture tells us about where this conflict is headed. Let's get into it. Segment 2. The escalating pressure. Estimated on-screen time, 5 minutes. The war began with a level of U.S. military dominance that was difficult to overstate. On February 28th, nearly 900 U.S. and Israeli strikes landed in Iran in a 12-hour window, killing Supreme Leader Khamenei, eliminating dozens of senior officials, and destroying large portions of Iran's air defense and missile infrastructure. Iran's retaliatory response, hundreds of missiles and thousands of drones, caused damage across the region but failed to fundamentally alter the military balance. The Strait of Hormuz closure was Iran's most powerful remaining card, and they played it immediately. What followed was a grinding, expensive, and politically difficult standoff. The Trump administration, under enormous domestic pressure from rising gas prices and a war bill climbing toward $30 billion, pursued a ceasefire through Pakistani mediation. A ceasefire was announced on April 8th. It never fully held. Both sides have exchanged fire in the strait since it took effect. The Trump administration has described it, in the president's own words, as being on massive life support. Iran's negotiating behavior during this ceasefire period has been, to use the diplomatic term, maximalist. Tehran's counterproposals have consistently demanded outcomes that no U.S. administration could realistically accept: recognition of Iranian sovereignty over the Strait of Hormuz, war reparations, frozen asset releases, complete sanctions removal, and an end to all fighting across all fronts. Not one of Iran's proposals has included any substantive commitment regarding its nuclear program, the program that, in the U.S. position, represents the core existential concern of this entire conflict. Iran currently holds approximately 440 kilograms of uranium enriched to 60% purity. That is not a civilian energy program. That is a weapons program in patient, deliberate waiting. The 90% enrichment threshold required for weapons-grade material is not a technical barrier for Iran at this point. It is a political decision about timing. President Trump has stated explicitly and repeatedly that preventing Iran from acquiring a nuclear weapon is his single highest priority in this negotiation, describing it as the most important thing by far. Iran's counterproposal contained no mention of the nuclear program, none. That omission, more than any single aggressive statement, more than any missile launch or vessel seizure, tells you everything about Iran's actual strategic intentions. They are not negotiating toward a settlement. They are negotiating to run out the clock, protect the nuclear program, and extract as much economic relief as possible without surrendering the leverage that makes them strategically relevant. This week's armory seizure, a Chinese-operated vessel full of weapons, seized 38 miles off the UAE coast with no resistance and no security personnel present, was either the most extraordinary coincidence in the history of this conflict, or it was a deliberate and calculated escalation executed precisely at the moment when U.S.-China diplomatic attention was focused on the Beijing summit. The timing alone should tell you which interpretation is more credible. The Trump administration's response has been direct and unambiguous. Secretary of State Rubio stated that the U.S. will never support an Iranian tolling system in the Strait and does not recognize Iranian mining rights in international waters. He added, in a line directed clearly at Beijing, that the United States is not asking for China's help and does not need it. That is not a diplomatic pleasantry. That is a statement of strategic independence that signals Washington is prepared to act on its own timeline and its own terms. Trump himself told Fox News he believed President Xi's personal assurance that China would not supply military equipment to Iran. The Chinese-operated armory ship that was conveniently seized immediately after that summit is now a direct test of whether that assurance was genuine, or whether it was itself a masterpiece of the kind of plausible deniability that China has perfected over decades of strategic competition. Segment 3. What America is saying publicly. Estimated on-screen time, 4 minutes. The shift in Washington's tone this week is not subtle, and it is worth examining carefully because these public statements are not accidental. Governments at war do not make statements like these by accident. President Trump's language about Iran has hardened measurably. He has described their counterproposals as totally unacceptable and stupid, not nuanced criticism, but a rejection that closes negotiating space rather than preserving it. He has publicly stated that the ceasefire is on massive life support, which is an administration explicitly signaling to both allies and adversaries that the current pause in major hostilities should not be understood as permanent or stable. He has pushed the Justice Department to issue subpoenas to reporters covering the war in Iran to find their sources, an indication of the level of operational security concern and frustration with information leaks that exists within this administration on this conflict. Vice President J.D. Vance this week told reporters that U.S. negotiators are still making progress in peace talks with Iran, a statement calibrated to keep diplomatic options nominally open, but immediately followed it by reiterating that preventing Iran from ever obtaining a nuclear weapon remains the administration's absolute and non-negotiable focus. U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations Mike Waltz told Fox News that the U.S. has laid out a very clear red line in its latest proposal. That language, red line, carries enormous weight coming from a senior official of an administration that has already demonstrated its willingness to use military force at extraordinary scale in this conflict. It is not rhetorical. It is a declared threshold. Secretary Rubio's statement that the U.S. is not asking for China's help deserves extended analysis because it operates on multiple levels simultaneously. On the surface, it is a response to Beijing's stated support for keeping the Strait open and preventing Iran from going nuclear. At a deeper level, it is a warning to China that American patience with Beijing's double game has limits, that the U.S. is observing what China is doing behind the scenes and is prepared to take its own unilateral action regardless of Chinese preferences or objections. And at the deepest strategic level, it is a signal to U.S. allies in the region, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Kuwait, Bahrain, that Washington is not waiting for multilateral consensus before acting decisively if the situation demands it. Sources familiar with White House discussions have confirmed to CNN that President Trump is now more seriously weighing a resumption of major combat operations against Iran than at any previous point in the conflict. Several senior administration officials have begun questioning whether Tehran is structurally capable of making a genuine compromise, given what they describe as division within Iranian leadership between hardliners who see any concession as an existential threat to the regime and relative pragmatists who understand the economic trajectory is unsustainable. Iran's own government is feeling this pressure internally in visible ways. Parliament Speaker Kalibov, the same official posting social media defiance about delivering lesson-giving responses to aggression, simultaneously released audio messages warning ordinary Iranians to prepare for a period of significant economic hardship and calling on all citizens to practice frugality and saving. A government simultaneously projecting military defiance and warning citizens to prepare for economic hardship is a government under serious and compounding strain. Segment 4. The military picture. Estimated on-screen time, 5 minutes. Let us now talk about what America is actually prepared to do militarily, because the capabilities in the region are significant, specific, and largely unreported in the mainstream press. Admiral Brad Cooper's recent congressional testimony under oath outlined a military posture that is built specifically around the threat Iran's asymmetric naval strategy presents. The IRGC Mosquito fleet, estimated at hundreds to potentially 1,000 fast attack craft armed with heavy machine guns and, on the larger variants, anti-ship cruise missiles, is the primary operational tool Iran uses to harass commercial shipping, enforce the strait closure, and project power in the confined geography of the Persian Gulf. This fleet is fast, numerous, and effective in swarm tactics against larger conventional naval vessels. But the United States has had years to study this threat and prepare specific counters to it. The primary air platform for engaging Iran's Mosquito fleet is the A-10 Thunderbolt II, the aircraft being called the Boat Buster, and for very good reason. The A-10 was designed for sustained close air support against hardened targets. Its 30mm GAU-8 Avenger rotary cannon fires armor-piercing and high-explosive incendiary rounds with accuracy and volume that small, fast-moving surface vessels simply cannot survive. The A-10 is not a technologically sophisticated aircraft by modern standards. It was designed in the 1970s. But against a low-technology opponent using small boats in large numbers, its simplicity, durability, and raw firepower make it devastatingly effective. Dozens of A-10s are currently positioned in the region. The AC-130J Ghost Rider gunship adds a qualitatively different and even more devastating capability layer. The AC-130J carries a 105mm howitzer, genuine artillery firepower delivered from a circling aircraft with modern precision targeting systems. Nothing in Iran's Mosquito fleet has a counter to an AC-130J on station overhead. The aircraft can loiter, identify targets, and deliver sustained fire that would systematically destroy Iran's fast attack boat capability over a relatively short operational period. U.S. Army AH-64 Apache attack helicopters are also in theater, providing a highly maneuverable close attack capability that complements the fixed-wing platforms. The Apache's combination of Hellfire missiles, rockets, and a 30mm chain gun makes it highly effective against small surface targets in the coastal geography where Iran's fast attack boats operate. The U.S. has already demonstrated its willingness to use lethal force decisively in this conflict. The USS Charlotte sank an Iranian Navy frigate in the Indian Ocean, the first ship sunk by a submarine in combat since the Falklands War. U.S. forces have fired on Iranian oil tankers attempting to circumvent the naval blockade. These are not warnings or demonstrations. These are combat actions. The picture is clear. The United States has the assets, the doctrine, the demonstrated will, and the specific capability to dismantle Iran's Mosquito fleet in a sustained military operation. The only variable remaining is the political decision to execute that operation at scale. Segment 5. Strategic analysis and close. Estimated on-screen time, 3 minutes. The strategic picture, assessed honestly, suggests that Iran's gamble is becoming increasingly dangerous. Iran's calculation that economic pain and diplomatic stalling would force American concessions before the U.S. resumed major operations was based on assumptions about American political will that may not be accurate. The Trump administration has demonstrated, from the opening strikes of this war to the present moment, that it is willing to take dramatic and decisive military action at significant scale when it determines that the strategic moment is right. The domestic political pressure from gas prices and war costs is real, but it cuts in multiple directions simultaneously. Americans unhappy with 4.52 per gallon gasoline are not necessarily demanding a diplomatic retreat. They may be demanding a faster and more decisive resolution. Iran is running low on weapons, running low on economic resources, and running low on credible diplomatic options. The seizure of the floating armory this week was a resupply operation, a military force taking a shortcut because conventional supply chains are failing. That is not the behavior of a country negotiating from a position of enduring strength. That is the behavior of a military running low on options. The question of whether this moment becomes the turning point depends on decisions being made in Washington right now that we do not have full visibility into. But the signals, the hardened language, the frustrated tone, the reports of serious discussions about resuming major combat operations, all point toward a U.S. posture that is moving away from indefinite diplomatic patience and toward decisive action. Iran never saw this coming, or if they did, they bet that American resolve would falter before Iranian endurance. That bet may be about to be tested in the most direct way possible. Drop your analysis in the comments. Follow me on X and Instagram. Mac's Ready Room link is in the description. I will see you in the next video.